let's look at that. Why haven't we had the promises realised from the last 10 years?
Yeah, I think it's actually better for the nation to try to depoliticise rather than politicise this. And that was the point I was making. This is a long-term challenge that the country has faced. So the answer is we've made clear manifesto commitments. And obviously, and we were doing a huge amount of work on this immediately after the election. Obviously, the coronavirus crisis has delayed that work, and I think people will understand that. I mean, not that we haven't been working on social care, we've put a huge amount of money in, and actually we can come on potentially to some of the reforms that we undertook in the heat of the crisis that have made some really positive differences. But that is another challenge, but the internal discussions on these reforms have since then picked up again.
So no answer on when. One of the most negative aspects of underfunding of social care is the way it leads to autistic people and people with learning disabilities being left or transferred to secure hospital wards. Very often when local authorities can't afford to pay for the care they need for those people to live independently. You know, Secretary of State, well, the case of Bethany, and you know it took 14 months to get her moved out of an ATU into community care, where she is now happy, I understand. But this is a key issue, and it's a win-win situation, because good community care can be cheaper than the millions spent by the NHS in those inappropriate institutions, and we've got 2,000 people stuck in them. But local authorities have to be able to fund it. Now, I know that you've announced £20 million a year for this, but that level of funding is nowhere near what is needed. My party announced £355 million a year for that policy. So what are your plans to ensure that more than 2,000 people like Bethany can get the support they need to live independently in the community?
Well, I'm very glad that we managed to make significant progress in the individual case that you raised, but it shouldn't have to take my personal intervention to solve that sort of problem. I'm very glad to say that the number of people in secure inpatient units has fallen further since then. I was looking through, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it has fallen further. And you point out exactly why this is a good thing, because often the patient outcomes are better and it's cheaper for the system as a whole. The money we've put in has been very effective, and just to be clear about what this money is for, there is an overall saving to the system of people being in the right care, especially if that right care is community care rather than a secure inpatient setting. The challenge was that there's a double running cost in the transition as you support somebody to come out of an inpatient setting, often because of the sensitive nature of the vulnerable individual concerned. You need to both have the community team there ready and already employed and set up at the same time as keeping them supported in their inpatient setting. And so the money has unlocked the ability to get the community team there earlier to allow to support a successful transition into the community for some very, very vulnerable people with very high needs. So I'm really pleased at the progress that we've been able to make on that. And I pay tribute to those who campaigned on this front, because I totally agree with the importance of this direction of travel.
Thank you.
But there are 2,000 people. I think we really need to be looking at that as a more urgent issue.
Well, as I say, that number has come down significantly. There are some who have, for judicial reasons, there are challenges, and so it's important to go into each case. We've gone through to review the cases, the most serious cases, to assess in each case whether there's the ability to move them to a community setting. And as I say, we've managed to bring the numbers right down.
Thank you, Barbara. It's time to move on to more general topics. I just want to ask one brief question to kick off about this morning's news on the pandemic and the recent rise in infection rates, which is obviously very concerning. Indeed, we are now, I think, higher than the levels above which we would ordinarily have decided to quarantine people who are coming from countries that have the levels that we now have of new infections. I just want to ask your judgment, assuming we're following a similar trajectory to countries like France, Germany and Switzerland, do you see us going into a spike, or could this be a need to hunker down for a proper second wave?
Well, the number of cases has risen in the past few days, and this has happened right across the UK, and I'm obviously concerned about that. There is no inevitability to a second There is no inevitability to a second peak. It depends on the actions that all of us take. Of course, in government, we're concerned about this and we keep all options open. But everybody's got a part to play. And the strategy that we've discussed many times and that we've outlined is really clear, which is that the first line of defence is social distancing. The hands, face, space campaign, communications campaign, say wash your hands, cover your face, keep that distance, is very important. The next line of defence is testing and tracing, and that is radically stronger than it was in March when we faced the first wave. And we now, per head of population, have one of the biggest testing systems in the world, and our contact tracing is very, very sophisticated. And then the third line of defence is local action. And you've seen that I've taken quite robust local action in areas where there's particular spikes. And I don't like doing that, but I don't resile from doing it because it's necessary. And if you look at Luton or Leicester, then you can see that it's effective. But it is so important, as Professor Jonathan Van Tam said yesterday, that people take their responsibilities seriously and people don't become relaxed about this virus.
Thank you. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Sir, for your statement. I'd like to talk about patient recovery from COVID.
Yeah.
One of the great news stories that was hidden over August was that if you are admitted to ITU now, you're 50% more likely to survive than where we were before because
Yes.
the advance is dexamethasone.
Yes.
That creates a little bit of a challenge, though, because more people go to ITU or come out of ITU who need rehab. And I'd like to ask, what strategy has the NHS got in place to help rehab patients who are coming out of ITU suffering from COVID?
Look, first of all, the first thing to say is that people coming out of ITU alive who would otherwise have died is the sort of problem we like to have in the NHS. This is a good problem. But there's also absolutely no doubt of the severity of the consequences of long COVID. But I just want to slightly reframe the way you describe it, because the long-term impacts of COVID are not very strongly correlated with the severity of the initial illness. And so whilst we have a very significant amount of work going into supporting those who come out of hospital, having been hospitalised with COVID, and we've put in July, we put in £8.4 million into a research effort, and the NHS has set up a long COVID service. This is not just about people who are hospitalised. In fact, and this is really relevant for now, because the latest rise in the last few days has been largely amongst younger people, but it doesn't matter how serious your infection was first time, initially, the impact of long COVID can be really debilitating for a long period of time, no matter if your initial illness was wasn't all that severe.
Well, I'm really glad that you picked up on that, and it's good news to hear, because the Royal College of GPs have come out saying that we should have post-COVID clinics across the UK. Can you update us then on how the progress is going to get that sorted? Because I think you're exactly right. Patients have differing streams of how they present
Yes.
and what they're left with.
Yes.
And that's one of the big concerns that they have. So could you expand on what you just
Yes.
mentioned?
So the NHS set up long COVID clinics and announced them in July. I'm concerned by reports this morning from the Royal College of GPs that not all GPs know how to ensure people can get into those services. and that's something that I'll take up with the NHS, and I'm sure that we'll be able to resolve.
And in terms of that, I mean, research is still coming out. You mentioned research going in. What about education for professionals, for the public, of what to look out for, what this looks like? Because clearly, people may not even be aware that they've had COVID and then having symptoms that are leaving them feeling tired, loss of sense of smell, muscular weakness. Is there an education campaign that you could carry out to professionals and the public to make them aware of this?
Well, we have been circulating the evidence to GPs in the way that the NHS does, and with a new disease like this, obviously that's particularly important as new evidence comes through. That's partly what the research effort is all about, but we also need to highlight to the general public that there is support available in the NHS COVID service. One of the challenges is that there are not easy and clinically validated treatments for long COVID. The treatments that that our research program has discovered, like dexamethasone being the primary around the world, that was discovered in the UK, and but that's for hospitalised patients. And so there is a challenge, which is supporting people when actually there isn't a readily available treatment.
And the final question from me is, with regards to all this, there is a concern that you can get reinfected with COVID.
Yes.
Have you got any update for the public of whether that is still applicable and whether or not there is immunity out there?
Well, it's clear that there is some immunity from having had COVID, because we can, for most people, because we can see the rise in antibodies that follows from an infection. But we have also just started to see the first credible cases of reinfection. And through genomic analysis, you can see that it's a different disease to the one that the person got the first time round. But in all the cases that I have seen, it has been an asymptomatic second infection that's been picked up through asymptomatic testing. But the hard question is how, because one of the most difficult parts of dealing with this virus is asymptomatic transmission. What we don't yet know is the transmissibility of the disease, even from an asymptomatic person who might have had the disease before. But we've got a huge amount of work going on into answering that question. The answer to that question obviously ties into the effectiveness also of the vaccine. We have a much higher degree of confidence that the vaccine gives immunity, and that obviously is one of the things that we're testing as part of the vaccine trials, which, as you know, better than anybody, you can never have confidence in them coming to a successful conclusion until they do, but they are making good progress.
Thank you. Just before I bring in Neil Hanvey, I sent you a couple of weeks ago a letter from a lady called Robin Gorner, who speaks for an association, a group of people who've got long COVID, as she does. I just wondered if it'd be possible to have a reply to that letter fairly soon, because they make some very sensible suggestions.
Yes, I saw the letter last night, and we'll get a reply very quickly. This is an incredibly important area to me.
Thank you.
And the other thing I'd say on it is this, that people of all ages are affected by long COVID, and people who are younger, who might think that they're unlikely to get severe symptoms or die of COVID, can still have a terrible illness that completely changes their lives for months and months and months. And we saw this morning the evidence from King's College that shows around 60,000 people who they have found who have conditions of COVID that last over 3 months. This is a really serious consequence of the disease.
Thank you. Neil Hanvey.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. Any member of a clinical team would say that trust and confidence in the team is one of the most important aspects to the care that you provide to a patient. And so with this, public trust and confidence with COVID is absolutely essential. And we've been reassured on multiple occasions that the decisions are led by the science. And I just wanted to explore that a little bit with you, and I'm turning the clock back to June, and Professor Sir John Edmonds said, and I'll quote him verbatim, "I wish we had gone into lockdown earlier. I think that has cost a lot of lives, unfortunately." On the same weekend, you said that you felt that the government had taken the right decision. And I'd just be interested to know if you can detail what scientific evidence you referred to when you said that you were guided by the balance of opinion. You know, what were the convincing premises that were presented to you, and what enabled you to feel robust enough in your position to challenge an esteemed professor?
Well, the advice as ministers that we, on which we base decisions, guided by the science, is obviously gathered broadly, and there's a role for a number of committees and a breadth of scientists, and then is presented to ministers by the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer. And the Chief Medical Officer, obviously, in each nation of the UK. And the decisions that we took in March were guided by the science, in the same way that the governments of the devolved governments in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast took decisions at the same time. So that was guided by the science in the same way.
So that's quite an extraordinary decision. It's not something that cabinet secretaries or politicians take often, to lock down the country. So I'm just curious as to whether you can remember what was convincing about the decision. What were the elements of scientific evidence that were presented to you that made you believe that that was the right time to make the decision? Can you recall what was the clincher?
Well, the clincher was that the number of cases was going up, and it was clear we needed to take significant and urgent action, which we did.
Okay. And with regards to the comments that were made by Sir John Edmonds later, Professor Sir John Edmonds later in the year, that there was a discussion about locking down earlier, and that he regretted that that decision wasn't taken a week earlier, and he projected, as an epidemiologist would do, what the consequences of that delay would be. What was your recollection that gave you the confidence to say that the government took the right decision at the right time?
Well, there'll be there's plenty of scientific debate around this question,
what convinced you?
To take the action necessary, it was absolutely clear that the number of cases was rising, and we'd seen the rise in the number of cases happening elsewhere, and that it was clear that this was a very significant disease. So
I appreciate that in the heat of the moment. Sorry, Secretary of State. I appreciate in the heat of the moment that you felt that was right, but I'm talking about your reflections on the 7th of June, where you said that you discounted the opinion of Professor Sir John Edmonds, and you felt that the government had taken the right decisions at the right time. What gave you the confidence to make that comment some months later?
Well, the thing is that you take decisions based on the information that you have at the time, and this is, all four of the UK governments took those decisions. Sure. At the same time. I remember being in those meetings when they were decided on.
Okay, so just final point, if I may, Chair. So I understand that in the heat of the moment you make decisions, but although Sir John was able to reflect that perhaps we should have gone earlier, you didn't feel that that was the case.
Well, as I say, there's a historical debate that will historical debate about this point, and understandably, I'm focused on ensuring that we stop this sharp rise that we're seeing right now, and different scientists will make their points. And the good thing about science is that you have a debate and you listen to all of it, and then formally I'm advised by the CSA and the CMA.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So next, I'd like to ask you, Secretary of State, about a report that we are shortly going to be publishing about the impact of the pandemic on core NHS services, the stuff we do in peacetime, as it were. And I want to start, if I may, by playing you a clip from a lady who gave evidence to the committee called Deloney Carlisle. She's 55 and she has an incurable but treatable cancer. This is what she told our inquiry during the summer.
As I started the lockdown in a clinical trial, I had a CT scan. The clinical trial showed that all my cancers were growing, and my doctors told me that I needed some chemotherapy. I then fell into a hole where I was absolutely in limbo. I didn't know, I'd had no communication about when this chemotherapy might start. So for most of the lockdown, I've been sitting here at home, knowing that all the cancers are growing, knowing that the tumours in my lung, in my liver, in my spine are all busily growing, and absolutely no word at all from the hospital about when some treatment might start. Now, I'm a single mum with teenagers at home. I absolutely, my priority is to stay alive. And I can't tell you how difficult that limbo period has been. What's your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction is to try to solve the problem in this case, and I very much hope that that since then that communication from the trust has happened, and my heart goes out to Deloney, and clearly we need to make sure that people get the cancer treatment that they need. There were, of course, important clinical reasons why sometimes treatments had to be paused, but that had to be done on an individual clinical judgment and communication with each individual patient. And I very much hope that that problem has been fixed already, and if it hasn't, I'd be very happy to intervene to ensure that it is.
Thank you. I think in that case it has actually been fixed, but it was probably illustrative of some general issues. On the 17th of March, just before the big lockdown started, Sir Simon Stevens sent out an instruction to the NHS saying that cancer treatment and other clinically urgent care should continue unaffected. In your view, has the NHS delivered on that promise?
Well, there are some cancer treatments that, according to clinical advice, were not appropriate to do when there was a pandemic. Now, here I defer absolutely to clinicians who should make these decisions. But where it was possible to continue cancer treatment, of course it should have continued. But in some cases that wasn't clinically appropriate. For instance, where a treatment was going to reduce the immunity of a patient, which might leave them more at risk because of the treatment, because there was a pandemic about and people might have caught coronavirus. So I appreciate that some treatments had to be delayed for clinical reasons, but that had to be done on the basis of an individual clinical decision about each individual patient.
So you're confident that where there was a clinical reason that it would be unsafe for someone to continue their cancer care, then it might have been interrupted, but otherwise it should have continued.
I'm confident that was the policy, but the policy was also that you should communicate with each individual patient, and that clearly didn't happen in each case.
So people like Professor Carol Sikora say that delays in cancer care could have potentially caused or will cause the death of 30,000 cancer patients. And the IPPR said recently that 5-year survival rates will now fall for lung, breast and colorectal cancer.